Hi everyone, this is Scott. If you want to learn about the world's oldest civilizations, find out how they were rediscovered, follow the story of Mark Antony and Cleopatra's descendants over 10 generations, or take a deep dive into the Iron Age or the Hellenistic era, then check out the Ancient World podcast. Available on all podcasting platforms, or go to ancientworldpodcast.com. That's the Ancient World podcast.
Welcome to Pax Britannica. Season 3, Episode 34, Glencairn's Rising. Welcome back to Pax Britannica. I'm your host, Dr. Samuel Hume. Before we begin, I'd like to welcome the new members of the House of Lords. Joshua Brett, the Marquess of Devonshire, David Crowther, Earl of Shedland, Earl Ben and Countess Rhonda, Barry Murphy, Earl of Evesham, Earl Stupid, Henry, Baron Kirkpatrick, Lewis, Baron Haywood Hopkins, Baron Widham, Kieran, Baron Marriott, Philip, Baron Massey, and David, Baron Davis. If you want to join their ranks and listen to the podcast ad-free, go to patreon.com/PaxBritannica. Last time in the narrative, we covered the early months of the occupation of Scotland. In the wake of the Third Civil War and Prince Charles's escape from Worcester, the new model army had, more or less, taken control of Scotland. The last fortresses fell to the English, and the army settled into an occupation which would last until the Scots were fully and willingly integrated into the new Commonwealth. Or until that Commonwealth fell. One or the other. Leading figures in Scottish politics, none more so than the Marquis of Argyll, Archibald Campbell, were brought into the fold by hook or by crook. The urban centres of the lowlands, Edinburgh, Glasgow, Ayr, Dundee, and the Venice of the northeast, Aberdeen, were occupied, and castles and fortifications were built to project military power across the nation. But as we saw, the reach of the English was not universal, and the preoccupation of the occupation with individuals like Argyll led the English to overlook the other potential leaders of rebellion. So it's time to introduce Glencairn, of rising fame. William Cunningham, the 9th Earl of Glencairn and the chief of Clan Cunningham, has been in the background of this podcast for a long time. He was, like the Marquis of Montrose, one of the Royalist Covenanters, a group of Scots who had sworn the Covenant and fought in the Bishops' Wars, but had opposed sending an army into England to assist Parliament in the First Civil War. 5 years later, he had been an engager, like the Duke of Hamilton, and for his troubles he was targeted in the active classes. Glencairn was not the leader of the rebellion from the start. Others like Glengarry were more influential in its early stages, but as we will cover today, he will become a leading figure, the leading figure, of resistance to the English occupation. The rising which takes his name was like the man himself, prioritising royalism and the support of the king ahead of religious questions. The lesson learned by many from the disaster of Dunbar, rightly or wrongly, was that the Kirk Party's insistence on religious purity had cost Scotland the war. Glencairn and his allies believed that only by placing loyalty to the king's cause above all else could Scotland be united and the English expelled. For the English, gaining the support of the Scottish population was essential for maintaining the occupation, especially in its early years. Because although the Royalist armies had been defeated and the lowlands of Scotland were more or less controlled, that didn't mean that Scotland was peaceful. In fact, it was anything but. Moss troopers, deserters and survivors of the many Scottish armies over the previous years, were still actively fighting the English occupation in the borders and in the Highlands. Despite English occupation, these regions were still restless. What was initially banditry gradually escalated into a full-on guerrilla insurgency, all the while helped by a sympathetic population. Getting information about rebel activities from locals was like getting blood out of a stone, while the rebels themselves were constantly informed about English troop movements. Horses and supplies were regularly stolen by locals and given to the rebels, and disgruntled Scots were a constant source of new recruits for the resistance. We touched on some of the causes for unrest in the last episode. Besides the obvious resentment of foreign occupation and opposition to the religious independence or support for the old Stuart line, a central factor was much more practical: money. Francis Dow, in his seminal work on Cromwellian Scotland, highlights the English policy of sequestration as a key factor in the growing unrest. This was the policy of seizing, sequestrating, the estates of Royalists who had not deserted the cause of the Stuarts before the Battle of Dunbar in September 1650. These lands would then be leased out, with the rents going towards the reparations for Scottish invasions in the Second and Third Civil Wars. Even before the true extent of the insurrection had become clear, there were those in Scotland who advised the authorities in London that the fear of these confiscations was driving moderate Royalists away from the English occupation. The Scottish commissioners urged London to simply name specific Royalists who would have their estates seized, rather than leaving it vague and making every Royalist a potential target. Parliament took the suggestion on board and debated doing so, but in the meantime, the sequestrations carried on. As Dow puts it, quote, "It is clear, however, that the results of Parliament's interim policy on sequestrations were sufficiently severe to endanger the hold of the English army over Scotland, for it was the material hardship caused by the confiscations or sequestration of their estates which drove many of the nobility and gentry to join in the Royalist uprising of 1653-54. The rising had its origins in the Highlands. Throughout the rebellion, the bulk of its soldiers were clansmen and tenants of Highlander lords, and the inconsistent English occupation of the Highlands and the rough terrain of the region allowed the rising to grow and gave the rebels safe bases to withdraw to. But the leadership of this Highland rebellion understood that it couldn't remain a Highland rebellion if it was to succeed. They'd need the lowlands to join them in a way they hadn't during Montrose's year of victories. Once the rising went public, their declarations insisted that the rebels posed no threat to the religious, social, or economic traditions of the lowlands. They only fought for the king, and that was a cause that many could support. We left off last time in December 1652. This happened to coincide with the transfer of Richard Dean and John Lambert out of Scotland, and the elevation of Robert Lilburne to the temporary commander of the army in Scotland. We talked a little bit about him last time, mostly to say that he hated his job, and it's easy to see why. He took over just before Glencairn's rising stopped being just the criminal acts of separate bands of Highlanders and became Glencairn's Rising, a full-on Royalist rebellion. Just weeks after taking command, Lilburne found his forces reduced, losing 2,500 men from his 15,000 infantry, and smaller reductions from the cavalry, dragoons, and artillery regiments. The war with the Dutch, why Dean had been transferred in the first place, was a much greater priority for Whitehall than a few bandits far away in the Scottish Highlands. Compared to a global naval power like the Netherlands, just a few short miles away across the North Sea, with ties to the Stuart dynasty and its fearsome financial strength, what were a few rambunctious Scots who hadn't got with the programme? This mindset dogged Lilburne's government, even after the Rising had become a united Royalist effort. All through 1653, as the Rising grew in strength, Lilburne would write south complaining that his army's pay was in arrears, that they were low on food, on ammunition, on new recruits to make up for those killed or injured in raids, and skirmishes and isolated murders. Many had fallen sick from malnutrition, or from being forced to sleep in the open. Lilburne was also limited in how much he could guard the coasts, from Dutch attack, of course, but more importantly for him, to catch smugglers bringing supplies and reinforcements to the Royalists. He only had 3 ships to patrol the east coast of Scotland, and he needed at least 2 more to do it properly. But even more than soldiers, the ships of the state's navy were destined for the war with the Dutch. Whitehall's prioritising of the Dutch war was the most important reason for this lack of attention, but tied into that was Lilburne's lack of political relevance. He had no strong allies on the Council of State, or particularly powerful friends in the Rump Parliament, and so his letters were too easy to ignore, especially when they had to compete with the state's navy for attention. We see Lilburne try to maintain a balancing act throughout his time in Scotland. His letters to London had to persuade the government that the rebellion in Scotland was a serious threat and needed to be taken seriously, that he needed more men, more money, more guns to put it down. But he couldn't make it seem too dangerous or out of control, because then the government might wonder why he was there. They might take issue with Lilburne's approach. And Lilburne had an approach, and in Dow's opinion it was a good one, if he'd been able to carry it out. Lilburne accurately diagnosed the major causes of unrest, and by the end of 1653 he had repeatedly made his recommendations to London on how to treat them. The first was to lift the sequestrations and seizures of Royalist estates, along with a broad act of oblivion, a pardon, wiping the slate clean for any previous acts, with the exclusion of 5 or 6 notable Royalists. The second was to allow Scottish soldiers to be employed in foreign countries, a tried and tested method for the rulers of Scotland to rid themselves of large numbers of young, militarily active men. It would also lessen the burdens for clan chiefs and lairds, who had to find something for these men to do, or pay them not to go raiding each other. The third was to allow Scottish notables more time to settle debts, and to order the courts of justice to moderate their sentences. Imminent bankruptcy, or a looming punishment, was driving many people into the arms of rebellion. Mostly, these suggestions were not followed while Lilburne was in office. There were exceptions. Lilburne was able to use his authority in Scotland to bring some financial relief to those who supported the English, or who abandoned the rebellion, but Lilburne was always hampered by a lack of resources, as well as by any personal failings as a commander. So, let's actually start talking about the Rising. The first signs that the disorder in the Highlands was part of a politically motivated conspiracy came in January 1653. On the 22nd, the governor of Ayr sent word to Lilburne of a gathering in the Highlands, headed by Glencairn. He knew about it because some of Ayrshire's elites had attended it. This report was soon followed by one from Inverness 2 days later, which informed Lilburne that Glencairn had hosted another meeting of local clans, apparently to help mend a feud between two of them, but which had instead met to discuss strategy for an upcoming rebellion. The meeting broke up with most chiefs unwilling to fully commit to any rebellion, but Glencairn was able to get agreement for a flying column of 2,000 men to be recruited. The report also added that, in the author's judgment, what support there was for a rebellion was driven by financial hardship. February's bad news was capped off by the report of a messenger from the exiled king landing in Fife and escaping into the Highlands before he could be captured. It was an ominous sign. What message had he been carrying, and who was it intended for? Though these were troubling events, March was a much better month for the occupation. Besides the English victory at Portland over the Dutch, which was a serious blow to Royalist hopes, Lilburne received word that those 2,000 men had dispersed and gone home. April looked even better. He wrote that the Highlands were in a, quote, very peaceable posture, and there was, quote, a great inclination in the commonalty to acquiesce and submit to the present government. There was still violence in the Highlands, of course, it was the Highlands, but Lilburne decided that the skirmishes, raids and murders were purely defensive on the Royalist part. They were reacting to English attempts to suppress the rebellion, not proactively expanding it. Lilburne also had the assurances of the occupation's most powerful ally, the Marquis of Argyll, that he was doing everything he could to keep the peace in his territory, and was using his influence to keep the violence from spreading. Lilburne did not trust these promises, but at the moment all he could do was hope that the effort spent winning Argyll over would pay off. The great Highland chief could act as a counterweight to Glengarry if he could be trusted. In the judgment of Dow, Argyll was a useful convert to the Cromwellian regime, and this is not a flattering judgment. For the Marquess, this was a purely pragmatic alignment. His cause, the Covenanting cause, had been defeated. His country had been invaded and occupied by the exact sort of English schismatics he had feared. His own patrimony, his place in Scottish politics, his position in society, and the Presbyterian Kirk could still be preserved through collaboration with the English. There were other, more material concerns too. After more than a decade of revolution and civil war, after spending several fortunes, and after Alistair MacColla stole, destroyed, or killed anything and anyone tied to a Campbell, the immensely wealthy Highland chief was burdened with debt. Throughout the Cromwellian occupation, Argyll would negotiate with the English authorities in Scotland and England for financial relief. For example, during the Rising, Argyll urged Lilburne to give him and his tenants a suspension on the cess. His real hope was that the government would take his debts off his hands. He would chase this hope for the rest of his life. Anyway, despite Argyll's assurances and Lilburne's hopes, the unrest continued to spread. The Highlanders were not, in fact, passively reacting to English suppression, and as spring turned to summer, the political and military position of the rebels improved. In May, June, and July 1653, there were multiple meetings of Highland elites, and each time more of them declared their support for the Stuarts. This coincided with a firming up of their military organisation and an escalation in their attacks. There were still weaknesses in the Royalist coalition, though. Many of the elites still hedged their bets, waiting for foreign intervention before throwing themselves fully into the cause. And of course, Highland politics were still Highland politics. More than once, the Royalists gained the support of a chief or laird, only to lose that of his rivals. So here we are, in the summer of 1653, and about 16 minutes into an episode called Glencairn's Rising. So it's time to bring the man himself front and centre. In March, the court in exile had received a letter from the Earl of Glencairn. In this letter, he informed his king he was willing to join the rebellion, and, in the absence of Lieutenant General Middleton, he would be willing to lead it as an interim commander. Well, this sounded great to Charles, and so the court resurrected the idea of the previous winter, to commission several leading men of the Highlands as a council of war, and allow them to elect an interim leader until Middleton could arrive personally. Middleton himself was either convinced of this necessity or unable to veto it this time, and the commissions were sent out, with 4 new additions, including the Earl of Glencairn. These men were authorised to elect their commander. Charles put his finger on the scales, though, and he very helpfully suggested that they should pick Glencairn. And spookily enough, who did the Royalists elect but Glencairn? Yet Charles, tireless advocate of free and fair elections that he was still concerned that the council might make the wrong choice. So in addition to his commission adding him to the council, Glencairn also received a commission making him the interim commander, overriding any alternate decision the council might make. The exiled king did warn the Earl not to reveal this document unless he needed to, otherwise it might, make a mockery of the election and the authority of the council. Glencairn would keep this trump card close at hand, because he would need it. Because the divisions within Highland politics didn't go away just because a single leader had been chosen. In fact, Glencairn's assumption of power made some of these divisions worse. Before the Rising had been a loose coalition. Not everyone agreed with Glengarry's decisions, but they didn't need to. If they wanted to kill some English soldiers, they could just do that, while it remained a decentralised insurgency. But once Glencairn became overall commander and tried to make overall commands, many Highland elites chafed at his authority. In fact, it didn't take long at all for a rival of Glencairn, the Earl of Balcarres, to challenge him for his position. The king's secret commission came in very handy here, as Glencairn could reveal it and show just how much faith their king had in him. Glencairn and his councillors spent the summer of 1653 avoiding any major engagement with the English military, and focused instead on building up their position. Men, money, and supplies were recruited or requisitioned from all over Scotland. This approach had advantages as well as disadvantages. This strategy kept Highland rivalries to a minimum. Individual leaders could still, mostly, act as they wanted, and no one was forced to work together if they didn't want to. The Royalists were able to take advantage of the systems of occupation. They could arrive at a community and demand that the cess, which they were collecting for the English, was instead handed over to them. But not all of it. They could keep a quarter for themselves. This carrot was matched with a stick. If a community refused, or didn't hand over the demanded amount, then harsh punishments were threatened. With carrot and stick, the Royalists could build up their resources while depriving them to the English, and this approach seems to have been highly effective. Despite Lilburne increasing the security on cess collectors and their collections, by the end of the year he complained that only half the expected amount had actually been submitted to the central government. Even allowing for exaggerations from Lilburne, who was of course always trying to get more money from London, the rebellion was taking a toll on the occupation's finances. But there were disadvantages to this strategy. It was still fairly passive. The overriding belief among the Royalists was that they should gather their strength while they waited for the arrival of their true commander, Middleton, if not the king himself. Everything that the Royalists heard from the continent confirmed the belief that one or the other were due to set sail imminently. So, the rebels on the ground held off, saving their resources for when it would really matter. But there was nothing imminent about Middleton's arrival, and this allowed the best season for campaigning, especially with the English distracted by the Dutch, to be lost. But the Royalists were gathering strength. Throughout summer, English reports noted how many lowland Scots, young men of military age, were disappearing into the Highlands. After summer passed, and Middleton had not arrived, the Royalists began to use their new strength more energetically. Raids struck out of the hills, hitting towns and garrisons and patrols in the lowlands, and then retreating before a strong enough force could react. By the end of the year, Royalist commanders were confident enough, and their forces strong enough, to reach as far south as Dumfries and Galloway, even crossing the border into England in a raid on Carlisle. By this point, the rising had gone public, and English proclamations were matched by responses from Glencairn. For example, when Lilburne issued an order for all horses to be seized for use by Commonwealth soldiers, Glencairn made his own declaration, forbidding anyone south of the Firth of Forth from aiding the enemy, and threatening them with fire and sword if they did. Ordinary Scots were torn between two forces, both making demands and threatening violent punishment for disobedience. If this seems familiar to you, then you're not alone. There's more than a flavour of the contradictory demands we've seen levied on civilian populations during civil war. Over the second half of 1653, we really see the seesawing of Lilburne's reports. In September, he told London that the rebels were having no success against the true bases of English power, even if they were bleeding the occupation dry through ambushes and murders of isolated soldiers, or the seizure of the cess. But then in October, after a successful rebel raid, he reported that, quote, "This business begins to look more suspiciously than before," end quote, but that he didn't think the Royalists could do much over winter. Then, in November, he informed Whitehall that the rebellion was spreading and that the population was supporting it en masse. But then a few weeks later, he calmly informed the government that actually most of the lowlands were loyal, and he put more weight on their support anyway. And then again, just a few weeks later, he wrote to Cromwell and Lambert, telling them that the rising was dangerous, but not widespread, but that unless he got more men immediately, then the English would soon have to abandon the Highlands altogether. Lilburne's balancing act could give any gymnast a run for their money. By the end of December, The Royalists had withdrawn to winter in the Highlands. 1653 had been a good year for the Rising, but it ended on a few notable reversals. Two Royalist leaders, Sir Arthur Forbes and Lord Kenyon, were defeated in skirmishes, and on the 30th of December, Kenyon himself was captured at Glamis. Lilburne, meanwhile, could take heart that the Anglo-Dutch War was clearly running out of steam, and the great distraction must soon end. Next time, we will see how the tide turns. Despite the arrival of new leaders to the rebellion, the high watermark of the Rising was about to be reached. Down in London, the Rump Parliament and then the nominated Assembly had been swept into the dustbin of history, and Oliver Cromwell was now Lord Protector. Once the war at sea ends, Lilburne will finally get his wish, and George Monk will return to Scotland, with all the military and political power he needed to crush Glencairn's rising. Thank you for listening to Pax Britannica, and thank you to my House of Lords, particularly the King's favourites, Mike Sanders and Fernando Lopez Ojeda, the Duke of Hanson, Harold Hanson, the Marquis of Montague, Brandon Stansbury, and the Earl of Bradford, Richard Liddell. Go to patreon.com/Pax Britannica to join their ranks and listen to the podcast without ads. Remember that you can join the mailing list to get news about the show by going to the link in the description. For other great podcasts on the Airwave Network, check out airwavemedia.com. Thank you to Sounds Like an Earful for the interval music in today's episode, to my entire House of Lords, and to you for listening.